Okay, let's get started. So I'm Nick Patch, and I work at Shutterstock in New York on the international team. And we are hiring. We're at the job fair right now in New York, San Francisco, and Austin as well now, as well as some remote opportunities, but more in our offices. Anyway, on the international team, what we do is work to internationalize and localize our web applications, supporting many different foreign languages, foreign currencies, cultures with culturally relevant content, and formats, dates, times, so on and so forth. And through this, I have a lot of experience working with Unicode. Now, this talk is titled Unicode Best Practices, but best practices, that's very much a loaded term. I don't claim to have all the best practices, but Perl Best Practices came out a half-decade or so ago, and it's an excellent book. Lots of the best practices have stood the test of time, some haven't. One thing that's noticeably missing from it, though, is almost any mention of Unicode or UTF-8. So I'm hoping to fill in sort of a knowledge gap here. Last year, I gave a talk on fundamental Unicode, and that was very much sort of the beginner's guide to Unicode and UTF-8. This really isn't going to get into the fundamentals of it, but even if you don't know that, I'll have a lot of tips on what you can do in real-world solutions in your CPAN modules and web applications, web services, and so forth. So, you'll see my bias in these best practices with the very first one, and that is use Perl. Perl has excellent Unicode support, and it has since 5.8. I have many environments where I have to use 5.8, but that's okay. Well, I'd like to be using, say, 5.18 everywhere, but Perl 5.8 has a lot better Unicode support than many programming languages out there. And, the Python folks don't commonly say many good things about Perl, but I was surprised to see at PyCon 2013, this is one of the core contributors to CPython and PyPy implementations, giving a talk on the guts of Unicode in Python. And he says Perl has some of the best Unicode support today, especially with respect to regular expressions. So we're going to go over regular expressions, which Perl is excellent at parsing Unicode data. Then we'll go over some other aspects of working with Unicode. So first off, I mentioned 5.8 is great for working with Unicode. Yes, I prefer to work with more recent versions, but in 5.8, we'll see that in the majority of the examples throughout here, we're using 5.8 code. Only where it explicitly states a newer version is it needed for that version. One of the big problems with 5.8, though, is what some people know of as the Unicode bug, where you have a string and it could have Unicode semantics or not, and it's hard to tell sometimes. So that's why I recommend that if you have an option, you at least use 5.12, because 5.12 largely fixes the Unicode bug, and then 5.14 obliterates it. So if you have an option in the matter, just use the most recent version of Perl possible, and life will be easier. So let's go through the steps of, say you've got a Perl script, a Perl module, a web request where you're working with Dancer or whatever your web framework is, what the steps of working with encoded UTF data is versus Perl Unicode strings or character strings. So first off, you receive your UTF-8 encoded input, or really any character encoding. It's just on the web. well, UTF-8 is the most popular character encoding, so that's what we'll receive most of the time. And generally, if you are working with data interchange, you should be using UTF-8 by default, unless you've got a better reason to use something else, because there are legitimate reasons. So anyway, we receive our UTF-8 encoded content and decode it at the very beginning so that we consistently have character strings that we're working with throughout our code base. Then hack, work on your character strings. At the very end, encode, and you've got the UTF-8 encoded output. So you want to decode and encode at the edges of your application, so everything you work with is character strings. This is the biggest problem I see with Perl code, and especially legacy Perl code, that makes Unicode and UTF-8 hard to work with, is that commonly the code is all built around working with byte strings in UTF-8 encoded content, or a mix of character strings and byte strings. And if you start from this pattern in the beginning, it just makes life so much easier. So if you start your source code, your Perl code, with use UTF-8, that's another thing that I recommend to make life easier. And there's some confusion over what this does. All it does is it says, my source code is encoded in UTF-8. It doesn't matter if you have non-ASCII characters or not, because, well, ASCII is a subset of UTF-8. So yes, it's valid UTF-8. And I commonly use non-ASCII characters in my source code. I don't want to have to just start adding use UTF-8 at the top when I introduce one. Instead, I want all of my source code to be consistently interpreted as UTF-8, not Latin 1. And in addition to Perl reading it as UTF-8, it allows you to not have to decode your literal strings in your source. So if you didn't do this and you wanted to decode on input, well, you would have to actually have the decode UTF-8 and your literal string in your source code. So this avoids that, and it allows you to use non-ASCII characters in your identifiers, if that's what you wish to do, as well as your regular expressions. And you might be a shop that locally does comments and identifiers in another language, or you might just want to do some, funny convenience things like using the letter pi for your variable name. But anyway, I don't do that. I just consistently use UTF-8 because I rampantly use Unicode characters in my regular expressions in strings. Here, by the way, is my favorite regular expression. So if you're going to use this, say use UTF-8 at the top of your file. Also, I have to do a shout out to Bicycle Pearlmongers. If you haven't heard about it, join Bicycle PM. We've got an IRC channel. Here's a more real-world example. We have a regular expression with the Arabic script. This is actually Persian, and it's part of a language stemmer that I wrote and put on CPAM. And one thing about working with regular expressions, and this isn't even related to Unicode, but when you start getting larger regexes, it's very important to remember that regular expressions, that's a programming language itself. And I recommend, as well as Damien and Perl best practices, treating it like a programming language, using the X modifier so that you can have arbitrary white space. You can nicely lay things out and you can put comments. Because in a lot of the regex parsing that I do, well, it quickly becomes unreadable if there's no white space. And you'll also see with a lot of the Unicode-related regex features, it will become very unreadable very fast without treating it like the proper programming language that it is. So anyway, these are just a couple examples of using literal UTF-8 characters in a regex, and I'm a big proponent of actually doing that instead of escape sequences. For me, this is so much more readable than having to go and look up escape sequences throughout my strings and regexes. Then say in your pod, well, the use UTF-8, that's not going to cover that. You need to use encoding UTF-8 at the top of your pod file. And that makes it just so you can use any characters, like say, for example, that code came from this module, and you can see there the A. Well, I use encoding UTF-8 at the top of all of my pod because I so commonly use non-ASCII characters in it, and I just don't want to have to think about it later, even if I'm adding a few in. Then for I/O, well, if you want your input, output, including warnings to standard error, all treated as UTF-8, and character strings internally, this is a very convenient way to do it. The OpenPragma, you can set here that your Perl I/O layer is encoding, specifying the encoding as UTF-8, and let's ignore this part here for a second. Let's ignore the standard. So what we're doing is we're saying all of my file handles that I explicitly open will be decoded on input from UTF-8 to character strings and encoded on output. Now, if we add this standard at the end, that will also cover standard in, standard out, and standard error. So this is something that I like to use all the time because it just makes for less code explicitly encoding or decoding, and just does what I want in addition to using UTF-8. So here, let's take a look at it using both of those. This is production code at Shutterstock. We open sourced it in the LinguaStem U9 bundle of language stemmers based on stemming algorithms from the University of Neuchâtel. Because there are a lot of languages we work with at Shutterstock that don't have Perl stemmers already on CPAN. The Snowball suite provides a lot of languages, and we use that. But when we need to make new ones, we release them back to CPAN. Anyway, here we're using UTF-8 so we can have our literal characters here and not have to do any encoding or decoding. Then, because of the OpenPragma here, the tap output will just work. The warnings will just work. The tap output will just work. And this all works on Perl 5.8. Then there are a lot of modules out there that you use to do I/O. Say you have JSON that came in through a web request, and you're using either the JSON or JSON XS modules to decode it. Well, Decode JSON will actually take the UTF-8 encoded JSON and return a Perl data structure containing character strings, as well as, say, with HTTP response. The response object has a decoded content method which returns character strings. So oftentimes you'll be working with frameworks and modules that already have convenience methods or functions like this. But as a last resort, if the OpenPragma and the UTF-8 Pragma and whatever framework or serialization formats you're using doesn't provide what you need, or you're working with legacy code, then explicitly decode and encode by using the encode module that's bundled with Perl, and syntax like this, and this will return a character string. Now, I mentioned that I prefer to avoid escape sequences and just use the literal UTF-8 characters. There's some cases where you really should be using escape sequences. And my favorite one to use, I'll demonstrate in a second, but you have to use the care names Pragma and the full option to it. So let's take a look at that in use. That allows us to use named Unicode characters like Arabic kasra. This is a character that isn't a printing character on its own, but instead modifies the character that it's next to. And it doesn't have a display form that would be useful to us as a literal UTF-8 character. So when you're using combining characters or control characters or non-printing characters, this is the method I recommend, because you don't have to look up any conversions from the Unicode code point value to the name of the character. You can just use the name up front. And if you're using Perl 5.16, you don't have to specify use char name full because it's already done for you. So let's take a look at some of these regex features that, well, first off, some that may be a little confusing to folks who are used to working in an ASCII world. This one here, well, it matches digits. And I think I'm pretty sure everyone in this room has used this. You know, your 1s, 2s, and 3s, but you'd be a little surprised at your in Bengali 1, 2, 3 and Lao 1, 2, 3 that it also matches when you're in a Unicode context. And that may be great for some things, but it's pretty horrible for other things. Say you want to parse out those numbers and do some math in Perl, or you want to select, say, a cell number. Well, things are just going to blow up on you. So if you actually do want to be limited to your digits 0 through 9 in, you know, Western Arabic syntax, well, just explicitly do 0 through 9. Now, there's more than one way to do it, but this is just what I do because it's so explicit. I want 0 through 9, and that will just match what you'd expect in an ASCII context. But then there's also the word character matcher, which gets a little crazy here. You know, it matches your A, B's, and C's, 1, 2s, and 3s, underscore, as well as your alpha, beta, gamma, bopo, mofo, and Arabic. We've got some right to left action there. And so anything that Unicode considers an alphabetic or numeric plus the underscore, this will match. And well, yeah, you could, oh, and by the way, the word boundary, of course, uses those semantics as well. And you could go and write something like this if you wanted to actually match the traditional ASCII sense. And that's, well, it's a little ugly, but the one thing that I want to bring up is that I don't have any time to use this. I know there are uses, but I don't have any time to use this or this. Because alphanumerics plus underscore, whether it's limited to ASCII or all of Unicode, that's something that I just use as a convenience matcher on the command line when I'm doing one-liners, but not in production code because there's just so little use for me to be limited to that specific set or that larger set even. And by the way, there is a shortcut for the traditional ASCII Perl word, and that uses this property. We're going to take a look at character properties soon using P. But first, here are a few more that are a little different in the ASCII versus Unicode semantics. This matches whitespace. Your space and new line and tabs and so forth. And take a look at this. Be amazed at all of the additional Unicode characters that it now matches.
There's millions.
Now, this is one that you don't really have to worry about. It's sort of like silently upgrading. When you're using Unicode semantics, it's silently upgrading to something better. There's hardly any time where you're like, oh yeah, I just wanted the ASCII white space. The more white space, the better, in my opinion. And here's one that many folks may not have seen. And we know, \n is for the new line, but this is any line ending. So it matches LF, matches CR, form feed, as well as CRLF, which interestingly, it's matching CRLF all as one match. It's not, CR and then LF, because CRLF, that's essentially a cluster of control characters at the end of your line. And then there's next line, vertical tab, and so on and so forth. Well, it matches all of those. This is very convenient because I've had a lot of situations where I have to do a character class just like bundling all these different potential line endings. This is the dot. This is this slide is a experiment in minimalism with a 200-point font. Does anyone know what the dot does? Can anyone shout out what dot matches?
How high is it?
Any single character.
Anything like you like.
Yeah, so we got some.
Pads.
I like being heckled by Larry Wall. So the dot, I got some answers here. Any character, anything but new line. And technically, this is any Unicode code point except for the new line. And it's important to distinguish a code point from what the user may perceive as a character. Because we have a matcher, backslash uppercase X, that matches grapheme clusters, or extended grapheme clusters specifically. And this is a Unicode concept where you can have one or more code points that are bundled together as a grapheme cluster and are, in the user sense, these are characters. One grapheme cluster is one character to your user. But it may be multiple code points. So let's take this character. So we've got the Latin letter N with a diaresis. In German, you call them umlaut. Most people know about them, but this is very much not a German character. Where would you use a character like this?
In a heavy metal building.
Yeah. Although this is the only known use I know about here. And unfortunately, the Unicode Consortium, they didn't take Spinal Tap into mind when defining code points. So there's no single code point for N, Latin letter N with combining diaresis. In order to represent this, you have to have Latin letter N followed by combining diaresis. Another example of when I would use the named version. So this is one code point, two code points. Well, two code points total, 1, 1. It is one grapheme cluster, and backslash uppercase X will match that as one. So when you are working on the level of what users perceive as characters, I work with grapheme clusters. And I touched on this earlier, but CRLF is considered one grapheme cluster. It's actually a cluster of control characters that really, in the end, it functions as a single control character. So that's why it's considered a grapheme cluster. Now, backslash P, we saw a little bit of this before, but it's used for matching Unicode character properties. Every Unicode character has metadata associated with it, which they call properties. And learning some of the basics here can be very useful in pattern matching in your regular expressions. And I'll go over a few here. Well, first off, there's one just called ASCII. And this will match any one ASCII code point. So this is the preferred way that I match just an ASCII code point. If you uppercase that P, well, it negates this. So that's anything that is not an ASCII code point. So when a lot of people say UTF-8 characters or Unicode characters, this is what they mean, even though UTF-8 in Unicode includes the ASCII subset. I use this a lot for one-liners and ACK and such for, if I'm looking for non-ASCII data specifically. Then the most important Unicode property is the general category. So the name here of the property is general category, and the value is letter. And this just says let's match any character, or specifically code point, that has the general category property of letter. But that's a mouthful. Putting that in my regexes would make them long and unruly. So let's take a look. Because general category is so commonly used, there's a shortcut. You can just use the general category property, and we're just using letter here. There are even more shortcuts though. Uppercase L stands for letter here, and even when it's just one character, you can leave off the curly braces. Now normally I might say, okay, this is becoming unreadable, but if you use the X mode and you properly space your regexes and also comment what you want to do, I like this because it's just 3 characters. Here's some examples of other general category values like letter, mark, number, punctuation, and so forth. And there are even subcategories of the general category. So let's take S for symbol. There's also math symbol, currency symbol, modifier symbol, and there are 2 letter codes for that. You always have to use the curly braces for them. But learning a little bit about these can really help out when there are cases that you might use a character class and just throw in a bunch of characters that is like, oh, these are all the currency symbols. Well, someone's already done the work for you, and you don't even need a CPAN module like regex common. Yes, Dave?
Also, in the future, if Unicode adds more currency symbols, it'll just work.
Yes. So Dave brings up a great point that as Unicode expands, as it does frequently with new versions, well, new characters are added, and they may also be matched by existing properties, and your application will just be upgraded associately when you have the new version of Perl that supports the new version of Unicode. Another very powerful property that's commonly used is the script property. So the name is script, and here's an example value of Latin. And this will match any character that has the Latin value of the script property. You can use it as a shortcut with just the value. Fortunately, the general category and the script properties don't have values that overlap, so you can go and use your values for general category or your values from script. You can't do that with most of the other Unicode properties, but these 2 are so common that there are these shortcuts. And take a look at this use in a character class. Here we've got a character class where we're matching hiragana, katakana, han for kanji, Latin, and all of the common characters, the common punctuation and such. So this is a character class that will match any character in the Japanese writing system. And there are even shortcuts. These are standard Unicode-defined 4-letter abbreviations for any of the scripts. And cuts down on your code some, it's still fairly readable. Here's some other examples. You want to use your Egyptian hieroglyphs and such. And here's one in action using the Cyrillic property, and this is actually for the Bulgarian stemmer. Okay, let's head out of the regex land and take a look at casing. So here we have a German word that uses the sharp S. And also O with umlaut. I can say that now because this is German. So let's lowercase this word. And, well, yeah, we get the appropriate lowercase form for it. Now let's uppercase the word. Some folks might not expect what we get here because in common German usage, there's no uppercase form of the sharp S. Instead, they use uppercase S, uppercase S. Okay, well that's great that Perl will do this by default on our Unicode strings. But what about, this brings up some trouble with comparison because here, let's lowercase it and uppercase it and then lowercase it. Well, this is not going to match because now on the right side, we've got lowercase s. And this isn't just a problem with the sharp S. There are a lot of Greek characters where there are multiple cases depending on where they are in the word. And case folding is what we need, or you might refer to it as fold case instead of lowercase or uppercase. This is really only should be used for comparison, as opposed to returning a value for the end user to see. You want uppercase and lowercase to return values. But here we are using the Unicode case fold module written by fellow Shutterstock, Andrew Rodlin, and we are running fold case on both of these. What it actually does is returns the lowercase form, but the lowercase folded form. So it will be lowercase s, and this will match appropriately. You can also use this, say, in sorting, where you need to compare one value to another, and you want to make sure that you've got your case worked out well. But you don't have to just use this this CPAN module it's now core in 5.16. So FC along with LC and UC can just be used in your Perl 5.16 code. And then there's Unicode normalization. This is important because, as I mentioned, they're combining characters, but there are also pre-combined characters. Here we have the Latin letter O with diaresis. But here we have Latin letter O followed by combining diaresis. In Unicode terms, these are canonically equivalent, and for every intent and purpose, you should treat them as the exact same. But the Perl 5 equal operator, string equality operator, is not going to do that for you, so you need to normalize. Fortunately, Unicode normalize is bundled with core. Here we're normalizing to the normalization form composed. We're not going to be able to get deeply into normalization forms, but the main thing is just use the same normalization form for both, and yes, this will match. And hey, you can mix in your case folding and your normalization in order to match this, where we've got a mix of these two different issues we just looked at. So some may find it useful to normalize at the beginning of your I/O so that you can consistently work in the same normalization form. So let's take a look at that chart I showed earlier with that added in. We decode our UTF-8, we've got a character string, normalize it. There are a few different normalization forms. I can't get deeply into them today, but they're better for different ones are better for different uses. You work on your normalized string, and now this is not a requirement at all, but some folks like to normalize on output because the work you do can denormalize your data. And you might want to make sure that, say, your database, because you're outputting to your database, is all normalized. Then you encode, and you've got your normalized UTF-8 encoded output. Remember that the normalization always happens on character strings, not on your UTF-8 encoded byte strings. So let's take a look at, well, first off, at Shutterstock. On our current rate, we are releasing 2 to 4 new languages each quarter. About 2 months ago, we released Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish. And in December, we released Turkish, Czech, Polish, and Hungarian. So when we originally did that, There was a bug in our user interface. Can anyone here spot the bug?
It's sorting by Unicode code point values instead of collation.
Exactly. So it is sorting just based on the code point, the numeric value of your code point. And that means that, well, everything ASCII will always come first. But take a look at check here. This uses a Latin letter C with a diacritic mark on top. Well, that should come before the D. So we fixed that, and I'll show you how. By using Unicode Collation. Unicode defines a standard Unicode Collation algorithm, the UCA, and that's provided, it's actually bundled with a Perl core. First, you instantiate your new collator object, and then with that, you have the sort method, and you can sort a list or array and return the sorted content. So by default, this uses the default UCA algorithm, which is excellent if you have mixed data, just like here. This is in a variety of different languages. And the UCA is great for supporting content that's in a variety of different languages. It generally does the right thing. It doesn't use the rules of sorting from each language because different languages have different rules of sorting. If you want to do that, actually I'll show you that. If you want to do that, use Unicode Collate Locale. Say all of your data is German because you have, say, a German user and it's all German content. Well, then use Unicode Collate Locale, specify your locale as German, and it will sort using German collation rules. There are other things you can do than just sorting them. Say the example we used earlier, we can actually do that comparison with the EQ method here. We're specifying a level 2 in our instantiator. There are predefined levels of support, and this one is just saying we're ignoring case because we wanted to do both case insensitive and normalization insensitive comparison here. So that's another way to do it if you're already working with the Unicode collator. And in addition to working in your source code for your applications and scripts and such, it's also really important to test the Unicode functionality or the lack of Unicode functionality in your tests. Here is code that, let's see, Jim Keenan has this module, text CSV hashify, and he came to me and asked, well, is this, am I following the rules for Unicode? And I took a look at it, and one thing I noticed was that there was the \D being used to match a number and then parse it out and use it for the cell number in a CSV file. So I sent him a patch and also several test cases here that test it using these characters here. And now, well, first off, using test-driven development, I wrote the tests, ran it, it failed. So then made the fix, just switched it from \D to the character class 0 through 9, and the test passed, and submitted that through GitHub. And that's a pretty easy way to both fix code that may not expect Unicode character or non-ASCII characters, as well as test that it works. And even so, whether you are supporting Unicode or not, I recommend testing. And that's all I have for here. Any questions? Yes?
Just now for numbers, you could use Unicode UCD, which is part of the core, to transform that Unicode number into an actual number you can use.
Yeah, so he brings up a great point. There is the Unicode UCD. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. So he brought up the point that you can use the Unicode UCD module bundled in core, and that has a lot of helper functions for working with Unicode characters. UCD stands for Unicode Character Database. And there is a num function that you can import and use that to convert any digit in any language to digits that Perl will accept for doing math and anything you'd work with numbers for. And there's so much content to go over for Unicode. There's an entire Unicode conference. It's 3 days long, and we only have, say, 50 minutes or 45 minutes to work in here. I just wanted to cover some important things that will both help you eliminate bugs in your software as well as give you the power of Unicode. Yes?
Do we have the option to turn on and off UTF-8 pragma lexically?
Yes.
In 5.8?
So the question is, do we have the option to turn on and off UTF-8 pragma lexically? And wait, I wouldn't recommend it. I do not recommend turning on and off UTF-8 like within blocks. Your source code is either UTF-8 or it's not. So I'm not sure if that functionality is in there or not, but as early as possible in your source code, say use UTF-8. You are saying the rest of my file is UTF-8, and just stick to that.
It does work, though. I've tried it.
Okay, the comment from the side there is, it does work, he's tried it, and now I'm telling you don't do it.
Sorry, I implemented it.
It's not recommended at all.
It only works if you don't combine it with line 1. And if you have a line 1 character, even if you use no UTF-8, the power server will blow up.
Yes?
What about file names? I've run into some glitches with that. Like if you open a file name that's been written as Latin 1 encoded UTF-8 in the file system, and then you concatenate a Unicode string to it, and then go back to open that, it retranslates the file name and breaks.
So the question is about file names, and that's a tricky subject because the UTF-8 support, or even if they use UTF-8, varies from different file systems and different operating systems. That's an area that I don't have as much expertise at, and I leave that as a exercise to the audience to investigate further. Is that a question in the back or a stretch?
Question.
Okay.
It didn't work. I have a large code base that works with characters of many different character sets, but it evolved from an earlier code base that was not Unicode aware. So there are a lot of places where the characters need bytes. So we had to settle for now on using bytes everywhere and converting to Unicode before we do something interesting and then converting it back, just to avoid the double encoding problem when you concatenate. Is there a better approach to that when organizing code to make sure to segregate your Unicode from your non-Unicode strings?
So the question was that he was saying he's got a project. It sounds like a legacy project where originally everything was being, the work was being processed on byte strings, and when you needed to encode or decode to perform various operations, you would do that at the point of needing to do that work, instead of at the beginning and end of your code base. So what to do when you're moving forward and want to just use character strings. And my top recommendation is do not work with a mix of byte strings and character strings where you're sending them both around. Choose one or the other. Either make sure everything's a character string or nothing is a character string except when you need to do those operations. Ideally, of course, everything a character string. But I've worked with legacy code bases where you never know which it's going to be, and that causes so much pain in life. In those cases, I would have to do a rewrite of some sort where I look at the entire code base and see how can I rewrite this. So it's a big task. It gets hairy. Anyone else? Okay, thank you everyone.
All right, looks to be about 2:30, so I think we're supposed to start. So, okay, everybody hear me?